Hey Race, the rewritten version of your story's first part, reworked to meet your guidelines. Yes, that's what I believed, or at least that's what I thought at the time. My wife, Hilly, and I had been married for nearly 2 decades, having tied the proverbial knot almost 20 years ago. In fact, our 20th anniversary was only a few weeks away, coming up on December 10th. If I were honest, I wouldn't have changed much about our life together. Sure, like any couple, we had our fair share of disagreements, but the making up part was always worth it. That's just how we were, imperfectly perfect in a way. There was only one truly rough patch in our marriage, and it happened during our 2nd year together. We had gotten married young. Hilly was just 18 and I was 20. We'd been childhood sweethearts, growing up just a few houses apart. My older brother, Bob, had married her sister, Pam, a year earlier, so our union felt like the natural next step. The problem began when Bob and Pam welcomed their first child within a year of their marriage, while Hilly and I struggled to conceive. The doctors insisted we were overthinking it and assured us things would happen naturally. But Hilly's mother, who desperately wanted grandchildren, wasn't exactly patient. Hilly's family was traditional that way, and with her having 3 sisters, Jen, Pam, and 2 others, her mother was particularly vocal about wanting a boy, a wish she hadn't been able to fulfill herself. Pam and Bob's first child being a girl only added to the pressure. After some testing, the results were somewhat inconclusive. Hilly was perfectly healthy, but my sperm count was slightly below average, something the doctors assured me wasn't a major issue. They told us we simply needed to relax and let nature take its course. Your first child will arrive when they're ready, they said. We tried to be patient, but the strain on our relationship was undeniable. Thankfully, our wait wasn't too long. In the 3rd year of our marriage, Hilly gave birth to Linda, a perfect little girl. Despite the lingering desire for a boy from her side of the family, Linda's arrival finally put our fears about infertility to rest. Things settled down after that, and the peace in our marriage returned. It seemed that our newfound calm had an effect because, before long, Hilly was pregnant again. This time we had a boy, Tom. The family, especially Hilly's mother, was ecstatic. Don't get me wrong, the girls in our family weren't loved any less. But having the first son carried a certain significance, especially in Hilly's family. I couldn't resist a bit of boasting to Bob about being the first to have a boy. He took it in stride, simply smiling and saying, "Give me some time." Sure enough, he and Pam had their first son the following year, and not long after, Hilly and I welcomed our second son, Mike. It felt like we'd waited forever for children, and then suddenly, they all arrived one after another, like waiting for buses. Our extended family grew closer as more children came into the picture. Even as Hilly's other sisters married, they stayed connected to our tight-knit group. It was wonderful for the kids, and having so many relatives nearby meant we always had a babysitter on hand. As far as I could tell, all the couples were as happy as Hilly and I, enjoying the joys of married life in the comfort of a loving family. Of course, there were challenges. I remember when Bob had a serious accident at work, and I ended up spending hours by his side, giving him blood during his recovery. We often joked about being blood brothers after that. As our 20th anniversary approached, Hilly and I started planning how to celebrate. Inspired by Bob and Pam's celebration the year before, we decided to book a private room at a local hotel and invite friends and family for a big party. By then, Linda was a stunning 17-year-old, taking after her mother with her luxurious chestnut hair and striking green eyes. Her beauty didn't go unnoticed, and she often had boyfriends stopping by the house. But she was sensible, and I trusted her judgment. Tom, nearly 16, reminded me of myself at that age, rugged and athletic. He loved rugby and played halfback on his school's first team. Mike, the youngest, was a bit different. He wasn't as outgoing as his siblings, and sports weren't his strong suit. Instead, he excelled academically and had a thoughtful, introspective nature. Still, being a teenager, he sometimes felt out of place, especially compared to his siblings. That day, I found myself butting heads with Mike over something trivial. He'd left a mess on the dining table, and I insisted he clean it up before leaving the house. The argument escalated quickly, with him accusing me of picking on him. When I firmly reminded him I was his father and he needed to follow the rules, his response stopped me cold. "My father? Are you sure about that?" he shouted before immediately apologizing. Though he quickly cleaned up and left, the damage was done. His words rattled me. What did he mean by that? Was it just an angry outburst, or was there something more? My mind raced. Was Mike truly different from the other kids? Or was I imagining it? When I brought it up to Hilly later, she brushed it off, saying he was just deeper than the others. But was she being dismissive? Or was there something she wasn't telling me? The thought of a DNA test popped into my mind, and before I knew it, I was researching labs online. By Monday morning, I'd found one that could run the tests quickly, for a price. They suggested sending in samples from all 3 kids and myself for a thorough comparison. But collecting those samples, especially from Mike, was going to be a challenge. Even so, I managed to collect the samples, sent them to the lab, and began the agonizing wait. There was nothing left to do but wait and wonder. Was Mike truly my son? Over the next week, Mike seemed to settle back into his usual self, likely relieved that I hadn't revisited his outburst. I almost felt comfortable enough to gently bring up the topic with him, but I decided it was better to hold off until I had the test results. Now that I'd started down this path, there was no turning back. Hilly, meanwhile, continued to act like the same loving wife she'd always been. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary in our routine, at least on the surface. I can't say those days were filled with the most passionate moments between us, but I didn't turn her down. Still, the doubts gnawed at me. No matter how hard I tried to suppress them, I couldn't share intimacy with her without wondering if someone else had shared that same intimacy during our 20 years together. One evening, while having dinner with my brother and his wife, I almost blurted out my fears to Bob. We were so alike in so many ways, and logic told me he couldn't possibly be Mike's father. But the mere thought of it had me questioning my sanity. Had I really become that paranoid? Something held me back, though. I didn't want to burden him with my doubts, at least not yet. If the results turned out badly, I knew he'd be there for me, but until then, I decided to keep quiet. Hilly must have noticed my unease because she asked me a couple of times if everything was okay. "I'm fine," I told her, brushing it off. "Just have a lot on my mind." She looked concerned but didn't press the issue further. Then the results arrived. I'd arranged for them to be delivered to my office to ensure Hilly wouldn't accidentally open them before I did. With trembling hands, I tore into the envelope, struggling to make sense of the words on the page. Could this single piece of paper end my marriage? From what I could understand, Mike's DNA results matched mine well enough. A wave of relief washed over me, and for a moment, I thought the storm had passed. The report was littered with terms like good match and close match, which sounded reassuring, even if the medical jargon blurred in my mind. I thanked the heavens I hadn't shared my suspicions with Hilly. That night, I planned to make it up to her. Maybe take her out to dinner and move on from this nightmare. As I glanced over the cover letter again, a note caught my eye. The lab recommended calling them to discuss the results. At first, I assumed it was a ploy to squeeze more money out of me, but my curiosity got the better of me. "Hello, this is Davy Jones," I said when someone picked up. After confirming my information, I was connected to Dr. Hoskins, the doctor overseeing the tests. "Have you had a chance to review the results, Mr. Jones?" he asked politely. "Yes," I replied confidently. "If I'm understanding correctly, it seems my concerns about Mike were unfounded." "You're correct," he said, but his tone shifted. "However, it's not quite that simple." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean? Are you saying Mike isn't my son?" "No, not at all," he clarified quickly. "The likelihood that Mike isn't your biological son is less than 1 in a million. I would bet my career on it. He's absolutely your child." "So, Mike is definitely my son," I said, relieved. "Then what's the problem?" "It's the other 2 samples you sent us," he explained gravely. "The ones from your son's brother and sister." A chill ran through me. "What about them?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "It appears they are only half-siblings to your younger son, Mr. Jones." "Half-siblings?" I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. "What does that mean, doctor?" It means, he said carefully, that it's very unlikely you are their biological father. The phone slipped from my hand, and everything went black. The next thing I remembered was waking up in my office chair, surrounded by concerned coworkers. Someone was saying, "Give him some air," while another voice asked if I was okay. Nodding weakly, I assured them I was fine, even though I felt anything but. They insisted on driving me home, and I was grateful to find the house empty. Hilly was at her part-time job, and the kids were at school. With trembling hands, I called the lab back. When Dr. Hoskins answered, he apologized for the earlier call. "We usually handle sensitive results through mail," he explained. "It's not easy delivering news like this over the phone." I assured him I understood and asked him to go over the findings again. Mike, he confirmed, was undoubtedly my son. But Linda and Tom? The likelihood of them being my biological children was almost non-existent. Desperate, I grasped at straws. But the results said they were a close match, didn't they? Couldn't there be a mistake? If there were only one sample, the doctor said cautiously, we might have requested a retest. But with two samples matching each other as full siblings and neither matching you, the results are nearly conclusive. Unless I had a twin, I muttered bitterly, or a brother. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. My brother. Could it be? Dr. Hoskins suggested sending in a sample from my brother for confirmation, but I wasn't listening anymore. My carefully constructed world had shattered. What was I supposed to do? Divorce Hilly? Cut ties with Bob? Pretend none of this had happened? And what about the kids? No piece of paper could change the fact that I loved Linda and Tom as my own. But what about Hilly? And Bob? Questions swirled in my mind, and the weight of it all became unbearable. The next thing I knew, I woke up in a hospital bed, bandages on my arms and Hilly sitting by my side. "Davy, are you okay?" she asked softly. Her voice was tender, but I couldn't even look at her. How could I tell her that everything I thought I knew about our life together had unraveled? Paternity. It seemed like the burden had finally been lifted from Mike's shoulders after our talk. Yet, the situation was far from resolved. While Mike was unquestionably my son, there was no denying the truth about Linda and Tom. Both of them knew about their mother's affair with their uncle. They had known for years and, feeling helpless, chose to look the other way. The thought of Hilly putting our children in such a painful, compromising position made me sick. Tim, of all people, Hilly's brother-in-law and the youngest of her sister's husbands, was the man at the center of it all. He wasn't just any relative. He was married to and the youngest and most stunning of Hilly's 4 sisters. Hilly herself was beautiful, well, let's just say she could turn heads effortlessly. That realization felt like yet another punch to the gut as I pieced together the wreckage of my so-called perfect marriage. A few days later, I made one of the hardest decisions of my life. I invited all 3 of my children to lunch and laid it all out for them. Every sordid detail I'd uncovered. I didn't sugarcoat it, nor did I try to soften the blow. I had no idea how they would react, but to my surprise, they handled it better than I'd expected. Linda cried softly, while Tom buried his face in his hands, silent. Mike sat rigid, his jaw clenched in anger. They all wanted to confront Hilly immediately, but I convinced them to wait. I needed time to sort out my next steps, and I didn't want them to do anything rash. Despite their anger, all 3 swore their love and loyalty to me, vowing they'd never forgive Hilly. I had to remind them that, no matter what she'd done, she was still their mother and had cared for them their entire lives. Even as I spoke those words, I could feel the bitterness rising in my throat, but I pushed it aside for their sake. When the kids shared their side of the story, it became clear that Hilly's affair with Tim had been going on for a long time. Long enough for it to be more than just a fleeting mistake. Although it likely hadn't been frequent enough for Tim to be Mike's father, it had happened often enough to scar the family deeply. That night, all 4 of us, Linda, Tom, Mike, and I, ended up crying together. But tears weren't enough. I wanted revenge, not out of spite, but as a way to reclaim some semblance of control. Whatever I did, it had to avoid hurting my children further. After much thought, I realized there was no grand act of revenge that would fit. A confrontation would have to do, and the upcoming family gathering on December 10th, our 20th wedding anniversary, would be the perfect moment. That evening, 39 people gathered to celebrate, mostly Hilly's family, along with a few close friends. The dinner itself might have been delicious, but to me it all tasted like ash. When it came time for speeches, I stood up, feeling sweat trickle down my back as I took deep breaths to steady myself. This was it, the beginning of the end. "Welcome, everyone," I began, forcing a smile. For a few moments, I spoke about trivial things, trying to set a lighthearted tone. Then I shifted gears. "Tonight, we celebrate 20 years of marriage to my dear wife, Hilly," I announced. "And there are some very interesting and personal things I'd like to share about our marriage." Polite chuckles rippled through the room. A few crude jokes about our sex life made Hilly blush. They all thought I was being playful. They had no idea what was coming. As the laughter subsided, Linda rose silently from her seat and walked toward the exit. Tom followed her, and then Mike. They said nothing, their faces tense, as the entire room stared at them in stunned confusion. "You three, come back here," Hilly shouted, standing abruptly. "Don't be rude to your father." Tom stopped briefly to glance back at her. Shaking his head in disapproval, he followed his siblings out of the room. "Davy, do something," Hilly demanded, turning to me. "Tell them to come back." "It's all right," I said firmly, my voice unyielding. "They already know what I'm about to say, and since it concerns them, it's probably better they're not here." Hilly's face froze in shock. I could see her mind racing, trying to piece together the reason for my behavior. Slowly, she sank back into her seat, her face pale and trembling. As I was saying, I continued, addressing the table. "I've had 20 wonderful years of marriage, or so I thought. Imagine my surprise, just a couple of weeks ago, to find out that Linda, my beloved Linda, isn't my biological daughter." Gasps filled the room. Hilly let out a choked sob, covering her face with her hands. The silence was deafening. "Would you like to tell everyone who Linda's real father is, Hilly?" I asked coldly. She said nothing, only sobbing harder. "No." "Then maybe someone else would like to share? Who's been sleeping with my wife behind my back?" Still, no one spoke. The room was thick with tension as I glared at the faces around me, daring someone to step forward. My gaze lingered on Bob, my brother, who visibly shrank under my scrutiny. "Do I really have to say it out loud?" I demanded. To my shock, it was Pam, Bob's wife, who stood up. "It's not what you think, Davy," she cried, her voice trembling. "It wasn't some sordid affair. It was just sex. A few times. To help Hilly get pregnant." My knees nearly gave out. Pam had known. She'd known. And it wasn't just an affair. It was a calculated decision. A plan cooked up by the family. My brother, my own flesh and blood, was Linda's father. The room seemed to split into two camps. Friends who were stunned by the revelation, and family members who couldn't meet my eyes. Slowly, the friends began to leave, muttering awkward excuses. Those who remained, they all knew. "So you all knew," I said bitterly, scanning their faces. "Every single one of you knew about this." A few nodded reluctantly. Others avoided my gaze. "And whose idea was it?" I demanded, my voice rising. All eyes turned to Jen, my mother-in-law. "Of course." "Thanks, Mom," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Your desperate need for a son in the family destroyed my marriage." "No, Davy," Hilly cried out, finally finding her voice. "It wasn't like that. It was just one mistake. I swear. One mistake," I repeated incredulously. "Just one." "Yes, darling," she sobbed. "It was only that one time. It seemed terrible now, but back then—" "So, what about Tom?" I asked, staring directly at Hilly. "Is he mine? Or do we have more surprises?" "Of course, he's yours, Davy," she whimpered, her voice barely audible. "Wrong," I shot back, my voice icy. "I had a DNA test done. His father is the same man who fathered Linda." The atmosphere at the table shifted instantly. Pam, my brother's wife, was the first to react. "What are you saying, Davy?" she gasped. Disbelief etched across her face. "You heard me, Pam," I said flatly. "If my ever-loving brother is Linda's father, then he's also Tom's." Silence fell over the room. The weight of my words seemed to sink in, and for a moment, no one moved. Then, realization dawned on Pam. She turned to Bob, her voice shaking with rage. "You bastard!" she spat, venom in every syllable. "You promised me. You swore it was just that one time." Bob didn't deny it. He just hung his head, clearly wishing he could disappear. "And you," Pam roared, turning on Hilly. "I agreed to let you use my husband for 1 week, and you kept sleeping with him." With that, she stormed toward Hilly and slapped her across the face with all the force she could muster. "You idiot! You blood-sucking cow!" Pam screamed, her voice breaking as she struck Hilly repeatedly. It took one of Hilly's sisters to pull Pam away, and even then, she was shaking with fury, tears streaming down her face. "Happy now, Mom?" I sneered at Jen, my mother-in-law, who sat motionless, her expression unreadable. But I wasn't done. I turned my attention to the man sitting opposite me. "And what about you, Tim?" I asked coldly. "You've been awfully quiet. Care to share your part in all this?" Julie, one of Hilly's sisters, exploded next to me. "You bastard!" she screamed, catching me off guard. "So it's true? What they told me that night was true. You actually slept with her." Tim froze like a deer in headlights, looking completely guilty. Julie turned her fury on Hilly. "And you? Did you sleep with all the brothers?" "Well, she definitely screwed Tim," I said, unable to hide a twisted sense of satisfaction as the chaos unfolded. I didn't." Tim stammered, but he was a terrible liar. He didn't even have time to dodge as Julie's fist connected with his nose. "Don't bother coming home tonight," Julie shouted at her husband. "In fact, don't come back ever." Pam wasn't far behind. "That goes for you too, Bob," she yelled. "I'm divorcing you. I never want to see your face again." Pam, Julie, and Tim's wife linked arms and marched out of the room, shouting at Hilly, "You're no sister of ours." I turned back to Jen, who still hadn't moved. "Happy now, Mom?" I asked bitterly, but she just stared ahead, unresponsive. Finally, Alf, my father-in-law, spoke up. "I'm sorry, Davy," he said quietly. "If I had known." He trailed off, clearly at a loss for words. At least he had the decency to try. Bob, however, had the nerve to approach me, his face a mask of shame. "Davy," he stammered. "What can I say?" "Nothing, you bastard," I snapped. Without thinking, I swung at him, my fist connecting squarely with his jaw. The force wasn't much, but it was enough to send him stumbling back, tripping over a chair and sprawling on the floor. He didn't bother getting up. At that moment, the party was over. The energy drained from the room, leaving only an oppressive silence. That night, Hilly didn't come home. She came by once to collect some things but never returned to live with us again. The kids refused to speak to her for a long time, and while I hated her, I knew I had to prioritize their well-being. Eventually, they let her back into their lives, though it was never the same. I remained their dad, while Hilly became more like an awkward aunt. The fallout rippled through the family. Of the 3 sisters who stormed out that night, 2 ended up divorcing their husbands. Pam stayed with Bob, but she made his life a living hell. She took revenge in her own way, slowly working her way through Bob's circle of friends, sleeping with nearly all of them. Whether their marriage survived, I didn't care. It wasn't my problem, though I found the whole situation darkly amusing. A few weeks later, and the youngest and prettiest of the sisters invited me to dinner. I went, and one thing led to another. We kissed, talked, and eventually ended up in bed. But this time it was different. We didn't just have sex, we made love. For the first time in years, I felt something real, something I hadn't felt since the early days of my marriage to Hilly. And I didn't rush into anything, but we continued seeing each other. Over time, I realized I wasn't with her out of spite. I genuinely cared for her. As for Jen, my meddling mother-in-law, her husband, Alf, finally had enough of her schemes. He bought a yacht and spent the rest of his life sailing around Europe. The sweetest revenge, perhaps, was that he occasionally invited me and the kids to join him. We spent weeks sailing through the south of France, the Canary Islands, and beyond. It became a new chapter of our lives. Linda eventually met and married a Spaniard whose family owned one of Europe's largest marinas. Meanwhile, Tom and Mike continued to live their lives, wary of settling down too soon. And me? I haven't seen Hilly in years. The kids tell me she often asks about me, but I just grumble and move on. As for Ann and me, we're still figuring things out. Maybe I'll give marriage another shot, but if I do, it won't be about revenge. It'll be about building something real.